Frank Beard is gone. At 77 years old, the man who spent more than 5 decades sitting behind the drums of ZZ Top has played his final beat. The news arrived on August 17, 2026, and for longtime fans, it was difficult to separate the musician from the sound itself. Frank Beard had been there for so long that his presence inside ZZ Top seemed almost permanent. He wasn't the member standing at the microphone. He wasn't the guitarist with the unmistakable hat and sunglasses. And despite his surname, he was famously the only member of the classic trio who didn't wear the enormous beard that became part of the band's image. But behind Billy Gibbons and Dusty Hill, there was Frank. Always there. Keeping time. Holding everything together. Beard died while in hospice care at his ranch in Richmond, Texas, with members of his family at his side. The cause of death has not been publicly disclosed. His passing marked the loss of the second member of ZZ Top's classic lineup, following bassist Dusty Hill's death in 2021. For millions of listeners, the loss is not simply the death of another famous drummer. Frank Beard's playing had been part of the soundtrack of their lives. To understand why that matters, you have to go back before the sunglasses, the elaborate stage shows, and the worldwide success. Frank Lee Beard was born June 11, 1949, in Frankston, Texas, and grew up in Irving. As a teenager, he became interested in drums, absorbing the sounds that were transforming American popular music. The Beatles became an influence, while the blues coming out of Dallas introduced him to another kind of rhythm. Looser, heavier, and deeply rooted in Texas. Music quickly became more than an interest. It became his life. Beard crossed paths with Dusty Hill during those early years, and the two played together in several groups. Their musical relationship would eventually become one of the most important partnerships in Texas rock. Then came Billy Gibbons. In 1969, Gibbons, Hill, and Beard came together around what would become ZZ Top. What started as a Texas rock band eventually developed into one of the longest-running and most recognizable groups in American music. Their chemistry was unusual. Gibbons could stretch a guitar line until it sounded almost conversational. Hill supplied a thick, steady bass foundation. Beard sat behind them and somehow made the whole thing feel effortless. His playing wasn't about showing off. It was about control. That became one of the defining characteristics of ZZ Top. Songs such as La Grange, Sharp Dressed Man, Legs, and Gimme All Your Lovin' carry the unmistakable pulse that Beard helped create. When ZZ Top exploded into mainstream popularity in the 1980s, their music videos turned them into international stars, but underneath the image was still the same three-piece musical relationship that had begun in Texas. The numbers tell part of the story. ZZ Top sold more than 50 million records worldwide, produced major albums across several decades, and became a fixture of rock radio and concert stages. In 2004, Gibbons, Hill, and Beard were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Yet Frank often seemed more comfortable letting the music speak. That quietness became part of his identity. He didn't need to dominate interviews. He didn't need to stand in front of the band. His job was behind the kit, where every kick, snare, and cymbal helped determine how ZZ Top felt. And that was the strange beauty of Frank Beard's role. People noticed the Beards. They noticed Gibbons' guitar. They noticed Hill's bass. But if you removed Beard's rhythm, the entire picture changed. Away from the stage, there was another side of his life. Beard married Debbie Meredith in 1982, and the couple had twin sons, Rory and Nico. He also had a daughter from an earlier marriage. For the people closest to him, Frank was more than the drummer whose name appeared on album credits. He was a husband, a father, a friend. And for Billy Gibbons and Dusty Hill, he was the third part of a partnership that had lasted for decades. They had shared rehearsal rooms, recording studios, airplanes, hotel rooms, and countless stages. They had watched their hair turn gray while the music continued. They had experienced success, exhaustion, laughter, and loss together. Then Dusty died in 2021. That loss changed ZZ Top forever. Gibbons and Beard continued performing, with Elwood Francis taking Hill's place at bass at Hill's request. The band kept touring, carrying the music forward while one of its original voices was gone. Frank himself continued to perform for years after that. Even when health problems forced temporary absences from touring, he returned to the stage. In 2025, fans watched him perform again after a period away from the road. His final years were a reminder of just how long he had remained connected to the band he helped build. Now that chapter has ended. Billy Gibbons is the only surviving member of ZZ Top's classic trio. And although the band has said it intends to continue, the loss of Frank Beard creates a silence that no replacement drummer can completely erase. Because Frank wasn't simply keeping time. For more than half a century, he was part of the identity of ZZ Top itself. And after everything these three men had survived together, the hardest goodbye was still waiting. The silence that followed Frank Beard's death was felt far beyond Texas. For more than 5 decades, his drums had been part of ZZ Top's identity. Then suddenly, there was no Frank behind the kit. On August 17, 2026, Beard died at his ranch in Richmond, Texas, while receiving hospice care. His family was with him. He was 77 years old. The cause of death has not been publicly disclosed. And almost immediately, the reaction began. Fans who had grown up with La Grange, Tush, Sharp Dressed Man, Legs, and Gimme All Your Lovin' began sharing memories of concerts, records, and the unmistakable rhythm that had followed them for decades. For some, Frank Beard was the drummer they remembered from an album purchased when they were young. For others, he was the musician they had watched from the crowd, sitting behind that enormous drum kit while Billy Gibbons stood beside him with his guitar. And for the people who knew him personally, the loss was much harder to put into words. Frank had not simply been part of ZZ Top, he had been part of their lives. The band immediately canceled scheduled performances in Salt Lake City and Colorado Springs following his death. But the story did not end there. ZZ Top announced that the tour would continue in Austin, with performances at ACL Live on August 22nd and 23rd. The choice of Austin carried a particular meaning because it was one of Frank's favorite places and had become something of a second home to him. There was something deeply fitting about that decision. The music would continue, just as Frank had wanted. But continuing did not mean forgetting. Billy Gibbons was now facing something he had already experienced once before. In 2021, he had lost Dusty Hill. For decades, Gibbons, Hill, and Beard had been the three men at the center of ZZ Top. They had started as young musicians in Texas and somehow remained together through changing musical fashions, changing technology, and changing generations. Then Dusty was gone. Now Frank was gone too. Billy was the last surviving member of the classic trio. And suddenly, more than 50 years of shared memories had become memories belonging almost entirely to him. When Gibbons spoke about Frank after his death, he didn't simply describe him as a great drummer. He called him a great friend and collaborator. He described him as one of the world's most naturally innovative drummers and a great and true son of Texas. Then came the words that captured exactly what Frank had meant to ZZ Top. Gibbons said Beard's signature backbeat was key to keeping ZZ on top. That sentence carried enormous weight. Because Gibbons wasn't describing an interchangeable musician. He was describing the heartbeat of the band. Frank's contribution was often hidden in plain sight. The audience might focus on Gibbons' guitar or the spectacle surrounding a ZZ Top performance, but the rhythm underneath everything had a personality of its own. It was Frank. For 56 years, he supplied it. And Gibbons knew exactly what had been lost. Yet there was another part of his statement that was almost as significant. The band would continue. Gibbons said it would keep on keeping on, because that was what Frank had wished. It was a painful decision, but it also sounded like something Frank himself might have understood. ZZ Top had always been bigger than one concert, bigger than one record. And now the band had to carry forward without the man who had helped define its sound. For fans, the coming Austin performances suddenly became something different. They were no longer simply dates on a tour. They became a chance to remember Frank. A chance to hear those songs again. A chance to stand together and recognize how much time had passed. Because when ZZ Top performed La Grange, the audience would hear the guitar. They would hear the bass. But underneath it all, they would remember the drummer who had spent most of his adult life creating that pulse. The man who rarely needed to be the center of attention had become impossible to forget. Frank's farewell is still unfolding in public through the band's statements, the Austin tribute performances, and the memories shared by those who knew him. But even without a staged funeral scene, the grief surrounding his death is real. And perhaps the most painful part is the realization that Billy Gibbons now carries memories that once belonged to three people. The jokes, the rehearsals, the first years, the exhausting tours, the strange hotels, the recording sessions. The moments when something went wrong on stage and the three of them somehow found their way back into the song. Dusty is gone. Frank is gone. And Billy remains. Three men who once looked almost inseparable had become two, and then one. That is what makes Frank Beard's death feel larger than the passing of a legendary drummer. It is the closing of a personal chapter in Billy Gibbons' life. And somewhere beneath all the public statements and concert announcements was a much quieter reality. Billy had lost the man who had been beside him for most of his adult life. Frank had been there before ZZ Top became famous. Before the millions of records. Before MTV. Before the sold-out arenas. Before the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He had been there when they were simply three Texas musicians trying to make something work. And now, after all those years, Billy was left carrying the memory of that beginning. The tribute performances would soon give fans a place to gather. But there was still one moment everyone would be waiting for. The moment when Billy Gibbons stopped speaking as the leader of ZZ Top, and spoke instead as Frank Beard's friend. The words he had already released publicly had made one thing clear. Frank wasn't merely someone Billy had worked with. He was someone Billy had loved, trusted and shared an extraordinary portion of his life with. And when the lights come up in Austin, when the music begins, and when the memory of Frank becomes impossible to separate from the sound of ZZ Top, the question will no longer be whether the band can continue. The question will be much more personal. What does a man say when he has to say goodbye to someone who was there for almost everything? That is where the story reaches its most difficult moment. Because the music can continue. The tour can continue. The songs can continue. But one friendship has reached its final note. And Billy Gibbons is about to face the memory of the man who spent more than half a century behind the drums beside him. There are moments when a musician's death feels like the end of an era. And then there are moments when it feels like the end of a friendship that has lasted so long, it has become impossible to separate the two. For Billy Gibbons, Frank Beard was both. Frank was there before ZZ Top became famous. Before the records. Before the stadiums. Before the television appearances. Before the sunglasses, the cars, the long beards and the mythology that eventually surrounded the band. He was there when three Texas musicians were simply trying to figure out what they could create together. And now Billy was the only one left from that original trio. Dusty Hill had died in 2021. Frank Beard was gone in 2026. And the man who remained was carrying more than half a century of memories. Billy's first public words after Frank's death were enough. "Today, Elwood and I lost a great friend and collaborator," Gibbons said, describing Beard as one of the most naturally innovative drummers, and a great and true son of Texas. Then he said something that reached straight to the center of Frank's musical importance. His signature backbeat was key to keeping ZZ on top. Those words weren't simply a compliment to a drummer. They were an acknowledgement of what Frank had contributed to the band. For more than 5 decades, that backbeat had been underneath everything. It was there in La Grange. It was there in Tush. It was there in Sharp-Dressed Man. It was there in Legs. It was there in Gimme All Your Lovin'. Millions of people knew those songs. But perhaps they didn't always stop to think about the person creating the pulse that made them feel like ZZ Top. Frank did. He sat behind the drums and let the music speak. That was always part of his personality. Billy Gibbons stood in front. Dusty Hill stood beside him. Frank stayed behind them. And somehow, the quietest man in the trio became one of the most important. That is what makes Billy's description of him as a great friend and collaborator so meaningful. Frank wasn't simply someone Billy had hired. He wasn't simply a musician who happened to remain in the band for decades. He was one of the people with whom Billy built his adult life. Imagine the number of conversations they must have had. The number of rehearsals. The number of flights. The number of hotel rooms. The number of nights when the three men stepped onto a stage and performed the same songs they had been performing for years, yet somehow made them feel alive again. That kind of relationship cannot be measured in record sales. It cannot be measured by awards. It cannot even be measured by the number of concerts. It is measured in time. And Billy and Frank had an extraordinary amount of it. More than 50 years. That is longer than many marriages. Longer than most careers. Longer than entire musical movements. They had watched the world change around them while ZZ Top remained remarkably recognizable. They had watched audiences get older. They had watched younger generations discover their music. They had seen vinyl give way to cassettes, cassettes give way to CDs, CDs give way to digital music and streaming. Through all of it, Frank remained behind the drums. And now, for Billy, those memories had become something else. Something he could never recreate. Because when Dusty was gone, Billy lost one part of that original musical conversation. Now Frank was gone too. The three-way chemistry that had defined ZZ Top for generations could never be duplicated. There could be another drummer. There could be another tour. There could be another record. But there could never be another first night when Billy, Dusty and Frank were all standing together as three young musicians wondering how far the road might take them. That moment existed only once, and it was now history. Yet Billy made one thing clear. The music would continue. According to Gibbons, the band would keep on keeping on, because that was what Frank had wished. There is something deeply moving about that decision. Because continuing is not the same as replacing. Frank cannot be replaced. His position in the history of ZZ Top is already permanent. The band can perform without him, but it cannot erase the sound he left behind. And that is why the upcoming Austin performances carry such emotional weight. ZZ Top is scheduled to return to the stage at ACL Live at the Moody Theater on August 22nd-23rd, with the performances intended as a tribute to Frank. Austin was a place Beard loved, making the location especially meaningful. When Billy walks onto that stage, there will be an absence beside him. The audience will feel it. Every fan who remembers the classic lineup will feel it. And every time the drums begin, people will know that the man who played them for more than half a century is no longer there. But his rhythm will be. That is the strange thing about music. The person disappears. The sound remains. Frank Beard's recordings remain. The concerts remain. The photographs remain. The stories remain. And every time an old ZZ Top song begins, there is Frank again. Not physically, but unmistakably. There is his timing, his shuffle, his restraint, his power, his feel, his personality. You can remove a photograph from a wall. You can empty a seat on a stage. You can cancel a concert. But you cannot erase what someone put into music. Frank had already given the world too much for that. And perhaps that is the most fitting farewell of all. Not a final speech. Not a final photograph. Not even a final concert. A song begins. The guitar comes in. The bass follows. And underneath it all, there is that beat. The same beat that carried ZZ Top across generations. The same beat that Billy Gibbons heard when they were young musicians in Texas. The same beat that Dusty Hill played beside for decades. The same beat that millions of fans came to recognize without ever knowing exactly why it felt so right. Frank Beard never needed to stand in the center of the stage to become unforgettable. He simply had to play. And he did. For more than 50 years. Now Billy Gibbons carries the memory of the friend who stood beside him through almost an entire lifetime. Dusty is gone. Frank is gone. But the music they created together remains. And somewhere inside those recordings is the closest thing the world will ever have to hearing the three of them together again.